Little girl came to the ranch. I haven't eaten in 2 days, sir. Please let me work for food. The forgotten child of Redstone Valley. It was June 1887, in the lonely heart of Redstone Valley, Texas territory. The sun hung heavy above the plains, turning every breath into dust and every shadow into gold. Not a single horse moved, not a single bird dared to cry. Then, out of the shimmering heat came a little figure, barefoot, weak and covered in dirt. Her name was Clara May, just 12, her dress torn, her eyes hollow but proud. She reached the old McGraw ranch, holding her breath as she saw the man on the porch. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I haven't eaten in 2 days. Please let me work for food." For a long moment, the wind stopped. Ethan McGraw, a widowed rancher hardened by loss, stared at her like he'd seen a ghost from the past. He didn't know it yet, but the day that little girl stepped through his gate, everything in Redstone Valley began to change. Ethan McGraw stood frozen on the porch, his weathered hands gripping the rail as the wind pushed dust around his boots. And for a moment he wondered if the heat had finally made him see things that weren't real. But the small figure didn't vanish. She stood there trembling, her feet cracked from walking miles barefoot, her hair tangled by the wind. Clara May lowered her eyes, afraid of the man's silence, the deep scars on his face telling stories she didn't dare ask about. One of the ranch hands whispered, "Boss, she's just a kid." But Ethan didn't reply. He took a slow step forward, his shadow falling over her as she swayed slightly, ready to collapse. "Come inside, child," he said finally, his voice rough but not unkind. She followed him, her steps weak, eyes darting around the wide wooden porch as if entering another world. Inside, the cool shade wrapped around her like mercy. A pot of beans simmered on the stove, and the smell made her chest tighten with hunger. She stood by the door, not daring to move until Ethan nodded. "Sit," he muttered. She obeyed, her small hands clutching the edge of the table, trying to hide the way they shook. He poured her a bowl, the spoon clinking against the tin, and watched her eat. Slow at first, then faster, until tears mixed with the dust on her cheeks. No one spoke. The ranch hands exchanged glances, unsure what to make of this fragile girl who had wandered in from nowhere. When she finished, she wiped her mouth and whispered, "Thank you, sir. I can work. I'm strong." Her voice cracked, but there was something in her eyes, a stubborn fire that reminded Ethan of someone he once knew. He asked where she came from, and she froze, staring at the floor. "Don't remember, sir," she said softly, though the lie trembled in her throat. Ethan studied her for a long time, then sighed and turned away. "There's a cot in the barn," he said. "You can stay for now. Work starts at sunrise." She nodded, her heart pounding with relief and fear together. As she walked out to the barn, the sky turned crimson, stretching over the valley like a wound. The horses shifted restlessly, sensing something strange in the air. Clara sat on the hay, pulling her knees to her chest, staring at the sliver of moonlight slipping through the wooden boards. For the first time in days, she felt safe, yet her mind wouldn't rest. Every creak of the barn made her flinch. Every whisper of wind reminded her of footsteps behind her. Out on the porch, Ethan watched the fading horizon, his jaw tight. Something about that girl didn't sit right with him. Her eyes, her silence, the way she seemed to carry a story too heavy for someone so small. But as the night deepened and the coyotes howled from the hills, he couldn't shake one thought. Maybe she hadn't come to the ranch by accident. The first morning came with the sound of roosters and the faint smell of hay drifting through the barn. Clara rose before the ranch hands, her small hands blistered from gripping rough tools. Yet she never complained. She cleaned the stalls, carried buckets of water heavier than her arms could bear, and fed the horses with quiet patience that surprised everyone. Ethan watched her from a distance, saying little but noticing everything. The way she avoided eye contact, how she flinched whenever someone shouted across the yard, and how she disappeared behind the stables when laughter echoed too loud. The men began to respect her silence, calling her the ghost girl, though never in cruelty, more in wonder. Each evening she sat by the fence, staring at the horizon as if waiting for someone who would never come. When supper was served, she took the smallest portion, eating slowly, her gaze lost somewhere far beyond the valley. Ethan tried to speak to her a few times, asking where she learned to mend saddles or handle a frightened colt, but she only smiled faintly and answered, "My papa taught me." That was all. At night, when the ranch grew quiet and the oil lamps dimmed, Ethan would sometimes hear faint sobs from the hayloft. He would stop by the barn, standing below without calling her name, listening as her crying faded into silence. Once, when the wind lifted her blanket, he saw a small silver locket around her neck, cracked down the middle. The next day, when she was tending the horses, he noticed it again, the hinge broken, a half of an old photograph inside. It showed a man in a sheriff's coat, his face half torn away. Ethan said nothing, but a heavy question settled in his chest. Why would a child hold on to half a picture of a lawman? And why did she hide it so carefully? Days turned into weeks, and though the summer heat grew harsher, Clara never slowed down. The ranch hands began to leave her small gifts, an apple, a ribbon, a new pair of gloves, but she always thanked them quietly and returned to work. There was strength in her silence, but also something haunted, something that made Ethan feel both pity and unease. One afternoon, as thunder rolled across the valley, she froze while gathering tools, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, stepping closer, but she shook her head quickly and whispered, "It's nothing, sir." Still, he knew it wasn't nothing. That night, the storm hit, lightning slicing the sky open. Clara sat awake in the hayloft, clutching her locket, whispering words no one could hear. Down below, Ethan sat by the fire, staring into the flames, knowing the girl hiding in his barn carried secrets the valley wasn't ready to uncover, and the wind outside seemed to whisper those secrets through every crack in the walls. The storm passed, leaving the valley soaked and silent, the smell of wet earth mixing with smoke from the chimneys as morning broke over Redstone. Ethan rode into town for supplies, his thoughts heavy with the image of Clara's frightened eyes from the night before. The streets were muddy, and people stood in clusters whispering near the general store. Something was different. The air felt tense, uneasy. As Ethan tied his horse outside the saloon, he saw a wanted poster nailed to the wall, an outlaw named Jack May, accused of robbing a train near Lubbock 2 weeks earlier. The poster showed a rough sketch of a man with a scar over his left cheek and a line scrawled beneath it. "Last seen traveling with a young girl." Ethan froze. A young girl. He turned away quickly, his pulse rising, but before he could mount his horse, a voice called behind him. "Morning, McGraw." It was Marshall Boone, tall, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who noticed what others didn't. He held a folded paper in one hand and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We're searching every ranch this side of the valley. The outlaw's dead, but his daughter may still be hiding. Folks say she's dangerous, trained to shoot, clever as her father." Ethan met his gaze calmly, though inside his chest something twisted. Boone unfolded the paper, revealing a hand-drawn sketch of a thin little girl with dark eyes and messy hair. "If you see a girl matching this, tell me," the marshal said, his tone firm but not unkind. Ethan took the paper slowly, pretending to glance at it casually, then folded it and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Haven't seen anyone like that," he said, his voice steady. Boone nodded but didn't move. "Be careful, Ethan. Desperate people do desperate things. That girl's seen blood, maybe even spilled some." With that warning, he turned and walked off down the street, his spurs clinking softly against the boards. Ethan stood there for a moment, the paper burning like fire in his pocket. When he returned to the ranch, Clara was in the corral brushing a horse, her small frame lost against the golden light. She smiled faintly when she saw him, but something in her eyes flickered, like she knew he had learned something. After dinner, when the others had gone, Ethan sat by the fire, the sketch in his hands, comparing it to the memory of her face. It was her, no doubt. The curve of her jaw, the tilt of her eyes, it was all the same. But how could a child be wanted by the law? He looked toward the barn, where the lantern still glowed faintly through the cracks, and felt a strange pull between fear and compassion. He could ride to town in the morning, hand her over and end it all. Yet every time he remembered her trembling voice saying, "Please, let me work for food," something in him refused. He folded the paper again, threw it into the fire, and watched it burn to ash, knowing he had just chosen a path that might destroy them both. The wind howled across Redstone Valley that night, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The lamps in the ranch house flickered as Ethan sat by the window, staring at the horizon where lightning split the sky in two. He hadn't spoken much to Clara since he burned the marshal's sketch, but the weight of that secret pressed harder with each passing day. Outside, the rain began to pour, turning the dirt into dark rivers. In the barn, Clara sat awake on her cot, clutching her locket as the thunder rolled above her head. The storm was loud, but not loud enough to drown the memories she'd been running from. She couldn't bear it anymore. Slowly, she stepped into the rain, her small frame swallowed by the night, and walked toward the dim light shining through Ethan's window. He looked up when he heard the knock, and there she stood, soaked, trembling, her hair sticking to her face. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. He nodded silently, letting her in. She stood by the fire, eyes fixed on the flames, her hands shaking as she opened the broken locket. "The man in this picture, he was my father," she said softly, her voice almost lost to the storm outside. Ethan felt his chest tighten but said nothing. "He didn't rob that train for greed," she continued. "He worked for the railroad, but they cheated him, took everything we had. The men he rode with wanted revenge. He tried to stop them when things went wrong. They shot him, and before he died, he told me to run. Her words cracked and tears filled her eyes. I ran for 2 days, sir. No food, no water. I just kept walking until I found this place. Ethan stared at the fire, his jaw tightening as the truth sank in. All the rumors, the whispers in town, the marshal's warning, they twisted in his mind like smoke. He could almost see the man in the locket, a father trying to protect his child from the darkness he'd fallen into. You should have told me sooner, Ethan said quietly. But there was no anger in his voice, only sorrow. Clara shook her head, her voice breaking. I was scared you'd send me away. I didn't want to lie, but I didn't know what else to do. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The rain softened. The thunder moved away, and the only sound left was the fire cracking between them. Ethan looked at her then, not as a stranger, not as a fugitive's daughter, but as a lost child who had survived more than most grown men could bear. He walked to her side, placed a rough hand on her shoulder, and said in a low, steady voice, You're safe here. Clara, I promise. She nodded, clutching the locket against her chest as the storm faded into quiet. For the first time since she'd come to the ranch, she felt the weight of fear begin to lift, though deep inside, both knew that promises in Redstone Valley were never easy to keep. The morning sun rose over Redstone Valley, painting the fields in gold as the cold wind whispered through the fences. Marshal Boone rode in again, his horse leaving deep marks in the damp earth. But Ethan stood calm on the porch, his eyes steady, and his words careful. Ain't seen her, Marshal, he said, his voice flat as stone. Boone studied him for a moment, then tipped his hat and rode away, leaving silence behind. Inside the barn, Clara pressed her hands over her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes as she watched him through the cracks. Time moved on, seasons changed, and the ranch began to breathe again. She learned to ride, to rope, to laugh without fear. The locket never left her neck, but now it no longer felt like a burden. When winter came and snow touched the valley, she looked at Ethan by the fire and whispered, Merry Christmas, Pa. He smiled, knowing redemption had finally found them both.